This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history of Kentucky Ridge, a remote settlement that existed in the shadow of the Appalachian Mountains during the final decades of the 19th century. What transpired there in the autumn of 1895 challenges our understanding of human nature and forces us to confront possibilities that conventional wisdom refuses to acknowledge. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a like if you find this investigation compelling, as it helps support the continued research into these forgotten tragedies that history has conspired to bury. Kentucky Ridge sat isolated in the eastern highlands, accessible only by a treacherous mountain trail that wound through dense forests of oak and pine. The community, established in 1847 by German immigrants seeking religious freedom, consisted of 43 souls living in simple wooden structures arranged around a central chapel. They called themselves the Brotherhood of Sacred Silence, led by Father Matthias Giles, a former Lutheran minister who had experienced what he termed a divine revelation in the wilderness. Father Giles arrived in Kentucky in 1852, a tall, gaunt man of 57 years, with penetrating grey eyes and hands permanently stained black from an accident involving sulfuric acid during his previous work as a chemist in Cincinnati. According to records preserved in the Knox County Historical Society, Giles possessed an unusual combination of scientific knowledge and religious fervor that initially attracted followers seeking both spiritual guidance and practical leadership in their remote settlement. The Brotherhood practiced a peculiar form of Christianity that incorporated elements of Germanic folklore and what contemporary observers described as natural philosophy. Church records, discovered in 1967 during the demolition of an abandoned farmhouse in Corbin, Kentucky, reveal that Giles conducted weekly ceremonies involving the consumption of herbal preparations he claimed could reveal divine truths. These substances, extracted from local plants using his chemistry background, produced what followers described in their journals as profound spiritual experiences. By 1895, however, something fundamental had changed in Kentucky Ridge. Letters sent to relatives in Louisville, preserved in the Filson Historical Society archives, began describing strange occurrences around the settlement. Mrs. Helena Zimmerman wrote to her sister in September 1895, "Father Giles speaks now of preparations for a great revelation. He spends days in the forest, returning with plants I do not recognize. The children have grown afraid of him, though they cannot say why." What we know of the terrible events that followed comes primarily from three sources: the testimony of survivors, taken by Knox County Sheriff William Morse, articles published in the London Sentinel newspaper between October and December 1895, and the investigative notes of Dr. Samuel Harrison, a physician and amateur anthropologist from the University of Kentucky, who arrived at Kentucky Ridge in late October 1895. On the morning of October 13, 1895, according to the sworn statement of Jacob Brenner, one of only 4 survivors, Father Giles announced that the time had come for what he termed the final communion. He had, he claimed, discovered the secret to crossing the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds. This discovery involved a ritual he had been perfecting for months, using a combination of local plants, specific astronomical conditions, and what he described as the sacred geometry of suffering. The ritual was to take place in a natural amphitheater, located approximately 2 miles northeast of the main settlement, a depression in the mountainside surrounded by ancient standing stones that predated European settlement. Archaeological surveys, conducted in 1923 by Professor Daniel Mackenzie of Eastern Kentucky University, confirmed that these stones, weighing between 2 and 4 tons each, had been arranged in a precise pattern sometime between 800 and 1200 CE, likely by ancestors of the Cherokee people who considered the site sacred but avoided it during certain seasons. Brenner's account, transcribed by Sheriff Morse and preserved in the Knox County Courthouse records, describes the events with disturbing clarity. 39 members of the Brotherhood gathered at the stone circle as sunset approached on October 13th. Father Giles had prepared a large quantity of what he called the sacred brew, a dark liquid that participants were instructed to drink in carefully measured portions throughout the evening, The first signs that something was wrong appeared approximately 1 hour after the ceremony began. According to Brenner, participants began experiencing what they initially believed were the expected spiritual visions. However, these visions quickly became uniform among all participants, something that had never occurred in previous ceremonies. All 39 individuals reported seeing identical images, vast underground chambers filled with figures that were human in shape, but wrong in ways that Brenner struggled to articulate. Dr. Harrison's notes, discovered in his abandoned office at the University of Kentucky in 1943, provide additional context. Harrison had arrived at Kentucky Ridge on October 28, 15 days after the ceremony, as part of a state investigation into reports of missing persons. His clinical observations of the 4 survivors revealed symptoms consistent with severe psychological trauma, but also physical evidence that defied conventional explanation. Mr. Brenner exhibits signs of exposure to extreme cold, Harrison wrote, yet the temperature on October 13th did not fall below 45 degrees Fahrenheit according to weather records. His hands and feet show clear evidence of frostbite, with tissue damage consistent with exposure to temperatures below zero for extended periods. When questioned about this, he becomes agitated and insists that the cold came from inside the stones, though he cannot explain what this means. The second survivor, Maria Kellner, age 23, provided testimony that corroborated Brenner's account while adding disturbing details. According to Sheriff Morse's report, dated November 2, 1895, Kellner described the moment when the ceremony went wrong. Approximately 3 hours after consuming Father Giles's preparation, the participants began hearing sounds from beneath the ground, rhythmic pounding that seemed to come from deep underground chambers. Father Giles became excited when the sounds began, Kellner told Sheriff Morse. He said the barrier was weakening, that soon we would see the truth that had been hidden from mankind. But the sounds grew louder, and the ground beneath us began to vibrate. Some of the women became frightened and tried to leave, but Father Giles ordered the men to prevent anyone from departing. What happened next, according to all 4 survivors, challenges rational explanation. The standing stones began to emit a low humming sound that seemed to resonate in the bones of those present. The temperature dropped dramatically, and frost began forming on the ground despite the mild October weather. Most disturbing of all, the survivors reported that the spaces between the standing stones began to darken, not with ordinary shadow, but with what they described as thick darkness that seemed to have substance and movement. Thomas Weiss, the third survivor, provided the most detailed account of Father Giles's final moments. According to Weiss's statement, preserved in the archives of the Kentucky Historical Society, Father Giles approached one of the darkened spaces between the stones and began speaking to something that the others could not see. His words, Weiss recalled, were not in English or German, but in a language none of them recognized, though it produced an instinctive feeling of revulsion in all who heard it. The father's voice changed as he spoke, Weiss testified. It became deeper, and there was an echo to it, as if someone else was speaking the same words at the same time. His movements became unnatural, like he was fighting against his own body. Then he stepped forward into that dark space, and we heard him scream. But the scream came from underground, from below us, not from where he had been standing. The 4th and final survivor, 16-year-old Anna Hoffman, provided the most psychologically disturbing testimony. According to Dr. Harrison's notes, Anna remained largely catatonic for weeks following the incident, speaking only in whispers and refusing to be left alone after dark. When she finally provided her account in December 1895, she claimed that after Father Giles disappeared into the darkness between the stones, the voices of the other missing settlers could be heard calling from underground. They were pleading for help, she told Dr. Harrison, but their voices sounded wrong, like they were speaking through water or through something thicker than water. And they kept saying the same thing over and over, that they could see us, that they were directly beneath us, and that the stones were like windows between their world and ours. The physical evidence discovered at the site supported elements of the survivors' accounts while raising additional questions. Sheriff Morse's initial report, filed October 30, 1895, documented the presence of 35 complete sets of clothing and personal effects arranged in a perfect circle around the central area of the stone formation. The clothing showed no signs of struggle or violent removal, suggesting that the missing individuals had undressed voluntarily. More puzzling still, chemical analysis performed by Professor James Whitmore of Centre College revealed that the clothing and personal items showed signs of exposure to extreme cold and a mineral composition consistent with deep cave environments. The ground within the stone circle showed unusual characteristics that persisted for months after the incident. According to reports filed by subsequent investigators, the soil remained permanently frozen to a depth of 3 feet, despite normal seasonal temperature variations. Plants refused to grow in the affected area, and animals avoided the location entirely. Local wildlife patterns, documented by Kentucky state naturalist Robert Fleming in 1896, showed that deer, elk, and even birds altered their traditional migration routes to avoid passing near the stone circle. Perhaps most disturbing of all was the discovery made by Dr. Harrison during his final visit to the site in November 1895. Using borrowed mining equipment from a coal operation in nearby Corbin, Harrison attempted to excavate beneath the stone circle to determine if natural cave systems existed that might explain the sounds reported by survivors. His excavation notes, found among his papers after his mysterious disappearance in 1896, describe finding worked stone and carved symbols at a depth of 8 feet, suggesting the presence of constructed chambers rather than natural formations. The symbols carved into these underground stones, Harrison wrote in his final report, bear no resemblance to any Native American petroglyphs documented in this region. They appear to be much older, and their geometric patterns create an optical effect that becomes disturbing when viewed for extended periods. I have made rubbings of several symbols, but find myself reluctant to study them closely as they produce a sense of unease that I cannot rationally explain. Harrison's investigation was cut short when he disappeared on November 28, 1895, while conducting a solo examination of the site. His horse returned to his boarding house in London, Kentucky that evening, but Harrison himself was never found. His excavation equipment was discovered arranged in the same circular pattern as the missing settlers' belongings, and his personal journal contained a final entry that suggested he had made a discovery of overwhelming significance. I understand now what Father Giles discovered, Harrison's final entry reads. The stones are not markers or monuments. They are anchors, holding something in place that should not exist in our world, but the anchors are failing, worn down by time and weathering. What the Brotherhood awakened that night was not a spiritual revelation, but a weakening of barriers that exist for our protection. I fear that my excavations have made the situation worse. If something happens to me, seal this place with concrete and steel, and pray that it holds. The official investigation concluded in January 1896 with a finding that 35 members of the Brotherhood of Sacred Silence had died due to exposure and consumption of toxic plant materials, though no bodies were ever recovered. This explanation satisfied legal requirements, but failed to account for the physical evidence or the consistent testimony of survivors. The Kentucky Ridge settlement was abandoned, and the surviving members relocated to various cities throughout the state, though none lived normal lives afterward. Church records indicate that Jacob Brenner died by suicide in Louisville in 1897, leaving behind a note claiming that he could still hear voices calling to him from underground. Maria Kellner disappeared from her sister's home in Lexington in 1899, leaving behind only a letter stating that she had to answer the call and could no longer resist the pull she felt toward the abandoned settlement. Thomas Weiss lived until 1923, but spent his final years in the Central State Hospital for the Insane, claiming that the ground beneath his feet was transparent and that he could see vast chambers filled with the missing settlers, unchanged by the passage of time. Anna Hoffman, the youngest survivor, married and moved to Ohio, where she lived a relatively normal life until 1934. However, letters discovered after her death revealed that she experienced recurring dreams throughout her life, in which Father Giles appeared to her, older and changed, explaining that the ceremony had succeeded beyond his expectations and that the separation between worlds was continuing to weaken. The Kentucky Ridge incident was largely forgotten until 1962, when Professor Margaret Chen of the University of Louisville began researching historical cases of mass disappearances in Appalachian communities. Her investigation, funded by a grant from the National Science Foundation, uncovered additional documents that had been overlooked by earlier researchers and revealed disturbing connections between the 1895 incident and other unexplained events in the region. 35 people entered the stone circle at Kentucky Ridge on October 13, 1895. Only 4 emerged, their minds shattered by experiences that defied rational explanation. The others vanished without trace, leaving behind only their clothing and the testimony of survivors who insisted that their missing neighbors were still alive, trapped in spaces between worlds that should not exist. According to local reports that continue to this day, on quiet October nights near the anniversary of the incident, hikers in the area still report hearing voices calling from underground, pleading for help that can never come. This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history in Kentucky Ridge, a remote settlement that disappeared from maps after the events of 1895. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a like if you find this documented case as disturbing as the archival evidence suggests. Kentucky Ridge sat perched along the Cumberland Gap, a settlement of barely 300 souls who carved their existence from unforgiving Appalachian terrain. In the autumn of 1895, this isolated community housed one of the region's most respected religious figures, Father Marcus Giles, a Jesuit priest whose arrival 5 years earlier had transformed the spiritual landscape of the area. What happened to Father Giles during the final weeks of October 1895 remains one of the most heavily censored incidents in Kentucky's ecclesiastical records, with church documents from the Louisville Diocese Archive containing entire pages blacked out or entirely removed. Father Giles, according to baptismal records preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society, had ministered to 17 different settlements across 3 counties. Born in County Cork, Ireland in 1834, he arrived in Kentucky following theological training at St. Mary's Seminary in Baltimore. Parish registers from 1890 to 1895 show his methodical approach to converting the predominantly Protestant population, establishing 3 new Catholic parishes and overseeing the construction of 7 churches. Local newspaper accounts from the Barberville Mountain Echo describe him as a man of extraordinary dedication whose sermons could move the hardest mountain folk to tears. By October 1895, Father Giles had gathered a devoted following of 43 parishioners who formed the core congregation of St. Bartholomew's Chapel, a modest stone structure built into the hillside overlooking Kentucky Ridge. Church construction records indicate the chapel's foundation utilized stones quarried from a cave system discovered during excavation. Stones that local Cherokee descendants warned contained hungry spirits, according to testimony preserved in the Cumberland Gap Historical Foundation archives. The first documented signs of trouble appear in Father Giles's personal correspondence, discovered in 1967 by Dr. Helena Vasquez, a religious historian from Georgetown University. In a letter dated October 13, 1895, addressed to Bishop Thomas Sebastian Burns in Nashville, Father Giles wrote, "Your Excellency, I must report disturbing developments in my ministry here. The cave stones incorporated into our chapel foundation have begun producing sounds during Mass, particularly during the consecration. Brother Timothy reports hearing voices speaking in what he believes to be Latin, although the words are not from any liturgy known to our order. Dr. Vasquez's research, published in the Journal of Appalachian Religious Studies, revealed that Father Giles had sent 7 increasingly desperate letters to church authorities between October 13th and October 27th, 1895. Each letter described escalating supernatural phenomena, congregation members falling into trances during services, children speaking in languages identified by visiting scholars as pre-Columbian dialects, and most disturbingly, changes in Father Giles himself. The final letter, dated October 27th, contained passages that Dr. Vasquez described as unlike anything in traditional Catholic mystical literature. Father Giles wrote, "The stones speak constantly now. They have shown me truths that Moses never dreamed. Revelations that make Christ's teachings seem like children's songs. I understand now why the indigenous people avoided this place, not because they feared what dwelt here, but because they recognized its superiority to their primitive beliefs. Brother Timothy Kowalski, Father Giles's assistant, survived the events of Halloween night 1895, but spent the remaining 34 years of his life in the Lakeland Asylum for the Insane in Louisville. His medical records, accessible through Kentucky State Archives, document repeated episodes of catatonic behavior interrupted by violent outbursts, during which he would scratch symbols into walls, symbols that Dr. Margaret Chen of the University of Kentucky's Anthropology Department identified in 1981 as matching petroglyphs found in unexplored sections of the Kentucky cave systems. The congregation's final gathering occurred on October 31, 1895, for what Father Giles had announced would be a special Mass of Revelation. Attendance records kept by Church Secretary Mrs. Eleanor Brightwater show that all 43 regular parishioners attended, along with 17 visitors from neighboring settlements who had heard rumors of miraculous healings occurring at St. Bartholomew's Chapel. Contemporary accounts from the 3 survivors describe an evening that began with traditional Catholic liturgy, but devolved into something that challenged their fundamental understanding of reality. Sarah Beth McClure, whose testimony was recorded by Sheriff Jeremiah Hawkins on November 3, 1895, stated, "Father Giles appeared normal when Mass commenced, though I noticed his vestments seemed different, darker somehow, though they were the same green chasuble he'd worn every Sunday for months." The transformation, according to survivor testimony preserved in the Knox County Courthouse records, began during the reading of the Gospel. Instead of the prescribed text from Matthew, Father Giles began reciting passages that seemed to cause physical reactions in his congregation. Mrs. McClure's account continues, "The words he spoke weren't English nor Latin like we was accustomed to hearing. They seemed to come from deep in his chest, like something else was speaking through him. Mary Patterson's infant started crying, but not normal baby crying. It was like the child was trying to answer back." The second survivor, 14-year-old Jacob Morrison, provided testimony that wasn't recorded until 1932, when he was interviewed by folklorist Dr. James Crawford for the Kentucky Folk History Project. Morrison, by then 41 and a farmer in Tennessee, recalled details that had been omitted from earlier accounts. The cave stones in the chapel walls started glowing during Father Giles's sermon, not like fire or lantern light, but cold light, blue-white like winter stars. And Father Giles himself began changing. His shadow on the wall behind the altar grew larger than his body, with shapes moving inside it that weren't human shapes. The third and final survivor, Thomas Brightwater, Eleanor's husband, provided the most detailed account before his death in 1923. His deathbed testimony, recorded by his physician Dr. Robert Kennelly, describes the climax of that Halloween service. "Father Giles raised the communion host for consecration, but the bread had turned black as coal. When he spoke the words of consecration, every candle in the chapel went out, but we could still see everything clear as day from that cold light coming from the stones. Then Father Giles began to change in truth." According to Brightwater's testimony, Father Giles's physical transformation began with his hands, which elongated and darkened until they resembled burnt tree branches with too many joints. His face, Brightwater claimed, stretched and widened until it was no longer the face of any earthly creature, and his eyes became deep holes filled with that same cold light from the stones. The transformation triggered panic among the congregation, but according to all 3 survivors, they found themselves unable to move or speak. Brightwater's account continues, "We sat there like statues while Father Giles, or what he had become, began calling members of the congregation forward one by one. Each person he touched simply dissolved, not like they were killed or hurt, but like they became part of the air itself. Mrs. Patterson tried to scream when her baby started fading away in her arms, but no sound came from any of us." The survivors' accounts diverge regarding the duration of this process. Mrs. McClure estimated that Father Giles consumed the entire congregation over the course of several hours, while Morrison believed the transformation and disappearances occurred within minutes. Brightwater's testimony suggests time itself behaved strangely within the chapel, with moments stretching impossibly long and others compressed into instant flashes. All three survivors agreed that their escape came only when Father Giles, having absorbed 57 other people, turned his attention to the chapel's architecture itself. Morrison's 1932 interview describes the entity's final act. The thing that had been Father Giles placed its hands on the altar, and the whole chapel began sinking into the ground. Not collapsing, but sinking like it was made of water instead of stone. That's when we could move again, and we ran. The investigation that followed challenged the capabilities of local law enforcement. Sheriff Hawkins' official report, preserved in Kentucky State Police archives, documents his arrival at the chapel site on November 2, 1895, approximately 36 hours after the survivors reached town with their account. What Hawkins found defied explanation. Where St. Bartholomew's Chapel had stood for 5 years, he discovered only a perfectly circular depression in the earth, 43 feet in diameter, and filled with what he described as water black as ink, though it reflected no light and seemed to absorb it. Hawkins' report continues, investigation of the depression revealed no trace of stone, timber, or any material used in the chapel's construction. The water, if water it was, could not be measured for depth, as weighted lines lowered into it simply disappeared without reaching bottom. Most disturbing, the surface of this dark pool bore constant ripples, as though something of considerable size moved beneath it. Dr. Cornelius Blackwood, a geologist from the University of Louisville, arrived on November 8, 1895, to conduct scientific analysis of the site. His findings, published in the Transactions of the Kentucky Academy of Science, documented several anomalies that challenged contemporary understanding of natural phenomena. The black liquid in the depression contained no identifiable minerals or organic compounds, maintaining a constant temperature of exactly 58 degrees Fahrenheit regardless of air temperature. Most puzzling, the liquid appeared to exist in a state that was simultaneously liquid and gas, with samples collected in sealed containers, evaporating instantly when exposed to sunlight. The investigation expanded when Father Michael O'Brien arrived from the Louisville Diocese on November 15, 1895, accompanied by 2 church scholars whose names were redacted from all official reports. Their week-long investigation produced documents that remained sealed in Vatican archives until 1978, when portions were released following Freedom of Information Act requests filed by Dr. Amanda Richardson of Indiana University's Religious Studies Department. The declassified portions reveal that church investigators found evidence of what they termed theological contamination, extending far beyond the chapel site. Father O'Brien's report describes discovering blasphemous symbols carved into trees throughout a 3-mile radius around the depression, symbols that matched no known religious tradition but caused immediate spiritual distress in anyone who observed them directly. Brother Lawrence Flanagan, one of the unnamed church scholars, conducted interviews with local Cherokee tribal members who had long avoided the Kentucky Ridge area. His notes, preserved in the archive of the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, record testimony from tribal elder Joseph Walkingstick, who claimed the cave system beneath St. Bartholomew's Chapel had been sealed by his ancestors when the first white men were still children across the Great Water. Walkingstick's testimony, as recorded by Brother Flanagan, described the cave network as a wound in the world where entities existed that predated human consciousness. According to Cherokee oral tradition preserved in Walkingstick's account, these entities fed on spiritual energy, growing stronger when humans attempted to commune with the divine in their proximity. The tribal elder's warning proved prophetic. The priest thought he could bring his God's light to this dark place, but darkness devours light here. Now the darkness wears his face. The church investigation concluded with recommendations that remain classified, though Dr. Richardson's research suggests they involved permanent consecration of the site and continuous monitoring by church authorities. This monitoring continued until 1943, when wartime resource allocation forced the Louisville Diocese to abandon their Kentucky Ridge observation post. The site's abandonment coincided with the first modern reports of unusual activity. Forest Service records from 1944 document multiple sightings by fire watchers of a figure resembling a Catholic priest wandering the ridge area during new moon nights. These reports, initially dismissed as wartime anxiety, gained credibility when game warden Ernest Blackburn disappeared while investigating poaching reports near the former chapel site in September 1945. Blackburn's disappearance prompted the first systematic search of the area since 1895. Kentucky State Police files show that searchers found Blackburn's clothing and equipment arranged in a perfect circle around the depression, which had grown to 63 feet in diameter since Hawkins' initial measurements. Most disturbing, searchers reported that Blackburn's badge and whistle, both made of metal, had been twisted into the same blasphemous symbols that church investigators had documented 50 years earlier. The search for Blackburn expanded to include neighboring counties, when his wife reported receiving telephone calls in which her husband's voice repeated Latin phrases that local Catholic authorities identified as perverted versions of exorcism prayers. These calls continued for 3 weeks before stopping abruptly on October 31, 1945, exactly 50 years after Father Giles's transformation. Modern investigation into the Kentucky Ridge incident began in 1963 when Dr. Richard Hartwell, a professor of comparative religion at Eastern Kentucky University, discovered references to Father Giles in a collection of papers donated by the family of deceased Sheriff Jeremiah Hawkins. Dr. Hartwell's initial research, conducted with 2 graduate students, revealed the systematic suppression of information about the 1895 events by both secular and religious authorities. Dr. Hartwell's team discovered that Kentucky Ridge had been deliberately removed from official maps beginning in 1896, with government surveyors instructed to indicate the area as unsuitable for settlement in all official documentation. Census records from 1900 show no acknowledgement of the settlement's former existence, despite clear evidence in pre-1895 documents that Kentucky Ridge had maintained a post office, general store, and blacksmith shop in addition to St. Bartholomew's Chapel. The systematic erasure extended to newspaper archives, where Dr. Hartwell found evidence of pages removed from bound volumes of the Barberville Mountain Echo, covering October and November 1895. Only fragments remained, including a partial headline reading, "Priest's Final Sir," and a classified advertisement seeking information about missing persons last seen attending religious services. Warning signs that Dr. Hartwell's investigation was attracting unwanted attention came in the form of break-ins at his university office in January and March 1964. Campus security reports describe both incidents as professional operations, where only files related to the Kentucky Ridge research were disturbed, with valuable equipment and other research materials left untouched. Despite increasing pressure to abandon his investigation, Dr. Hartwell made a crucial discovery in July 1964 when he located Sarah Beth McClure's great-niece, Margaret McClure Phillips, living in Middlesboro, Kentucky. Mrs. McClure Phillips had inherited her ancestors' personal papers, including a diary that covered the months leading up to the Halloween service of 1895. Sarah Beth McClure's diary, written in careful copperplate handwriting, provides the most detailed contemporary account of Father Giles' gradual transformation during October 1895. Early entries describe subtle changes in his sermons, which began incorporating references to older truths and deeper wisdom. By October 20th, McClure noted that Father Giles had begun holding private meetings with select congregation members in the chapel basement, meetings from which participants emerged, changed in their countenances, as though they had seen beyond the veil of earthly concerns. The diary's final entry, dated October 30th, 1895, reveals Sarah Beth McClure's growing unease with developments at St. Bartholomew's Chapel. Father Giles announced that tomorrow evening's service will reveal truths that will transform our understanding of divine purpose. Brother Timothy appeared greatly distressed during this announcement, though he said nothing. I have decided to attend despite my apprehensions, as refusal to participate in Father Giles's special services has resulted in social ostracism for other community members. Dr. Hartwell's attempt to publish his findings was blocked by university administration in December 1964, officially due to concerns about academic rigor. though private correspondence discovered after his death reveals pressure from both Catholic Church authorities and federal agencies whose identities remain classified. Frustrated by institutional obstruction, Dr. Hartwell planned an unauthorized expedition to the Kentucky Ridge site for the weekend of January 16-17, 1965. The expedition never occurred. On January 14, 1965, Dr. Hartwell was found dead in his university office under circumstances that Kentucky State Police classified as suspicious but not criminal. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrest, though the coroner's private notes, discovered during a 1987 records audit, describe physical evidence inconsistent with natural death. Dr. Hartwell's body bore the same twisted metal symbols that had been found at Game Warden Blackburn's disappearance site, though these had apparently been burned into his flesh rather than shaped from metal objects. Most disturbing, witnesses reported that Dr. Hartwell's office windows had been covered from the inside with pages of Latin text written in what appeared to be his handwriting, though analysis later proved the language to be an archaic dialect that Dr. Hartwell could not have known. Today, 78 years after the last official investigation, Kentucky Ridge remains off-limits to civilian access, designated as a geological hazard zone by state environmental authorities. However, modern technology has provided new evidence that the threat documented in 1895 remains active. Satellite imagery obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests shows the dark depression at the former chapel site has continued expanding, reaching approximately 100 feet in diameter by 2019. More concerning, thermal imaging reveals patterns of movement within the depression that suggest the presence of large organized entities beneath the surface. If you encounter a figure resembling a Catholic priest in the Cumberland Gap region, particularly during new moon nights, do not approach or attempt communication. Church authorities maintain that Father Marcus Giles died on Halloween night, 1895, but something wearing his form continues to seek new congregations for services that no human should attend. This is the story of one of the darkest chapters in criminal history from 1895 Kentucky Ridge, a tale so horrific that church authorities demanded its complete suppression from all historical records. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a like if you appreciate deep historical research into America's most disturbing unsolved mysteries. What happened to Father Thomas Giles and the 37 members of his Kentucky Ridge congregation during the winter of 1895 represents one of the most thoroughly documented yet inexplicable mass disappearances in American religious history. The official church records, sealed for over a century, tell a story that challenges everything we understand about human behavior, divine intervention, and the thin boundaries between faith and madness. Kentucky Ridge, situated in the remote Appalachian foothills of eastern Kentucky, was home to barely 200 souls in 1895. The community centered around St. Bartholomew's Chapel, a modest wooden structure built in 1878 under Father Giles's direct supervision. Giles himself, according to seminary records from Louisville Theological Seminary, was 53 years old, a respected theologian who had specifically requested assignment to this isolated parish after 20 years serving urban congregations in Cincinnati and Louisville. The winter of 1895 proved exceptionally harsh throughout the region. Railroad records from the Louisville and Nashville line indicate that supply trains could not reach Kentucky Ridge for 6 consecutive weeks between January and March. During this isolation, something unprecedented occurred within the chapel walls. Church attendance records, discovered in 1967 by Dr. Margaret Thornfield of Eastern Kentucky University, show that despite the brutal weather, congregation numbers actually increased dramatically during February 1895. Father Giles began conducting what he termed extended devotional gatherings that lasted from sunset until dawn. According to diary entries found in the chapel basement, these sessions involved intensive prayer, fasting, and what Giles described as direct communication with divine messengers. The diary, authenticated by handwriting experts at the University of Kentucky in 1968, contains increasingly erratic entries describing visions, prophetic revelations, and instructions received from entities Giles believed were angels. The final entry, dated March 15, 1895, reads, "They have shown me the truth of what lies beneath our earthly existence. Tomorrow night we shall join them in their eternal service. The 37 faithful have agreed to accompany me into the deeper mysteries. May God forgive what we are about to become." When the spring thaw finally allowed travel to Kentucky Ridge in late March, mail carrier Edmund Walsh discovered the chapel empty, except for 38 sets of neatly folded clothing arranged in circular patterns on the floor. Each pile contained personal effects, jewelry and shoes, but no human remains. Walsh's official report to the Harlan County Sheriff's Department, preserved in the Kentucky State Archives, describes finding the chapel doors unlocked, no signs of violence, and an overwhelming smell he characterized as sulfur mixed with something sweet, like flowers rotting in summer heat. Sheriff William Hackett arrived 3 days later with a deputy and the county coroner, Dr. James Meredith. Their investigation, documented in reports recently discovered in the Harlan County Courthouse basement renovation of 1983, revealed disturbing evidence that authorities attempted to suppress. The chapel's wooden floor showed burn marks arranged in complex geometric patterns. Dr. Meredith's autopsy report, though no bodies were found, documented the discovery of organic material of unknown origin, embedded in the floorboards that he described as neither fully human nor entirely animal in cellular structure. Most disturbing were the modifications made to the chapel interior during the winter months. Someone had carved extensive biblical quotations into the walls, but according to theological scholar Dr. Richard Kemper of Southern Baptist Seminary, who examined photographs in 1969, these were not standard scripture passages. Instead, they appeared to be corrupted versions of biblical texts, with certain words systematically replaced with terms from much older, pre-Christian religious traditions. The local newspaper, the Harlan County Herald, published only a brief notice about the disappearances, stating that the congregation had relocated due to harsh winter conditions. However, managing editor Harold Sims's private notes, donated to the Eastern Kentucky Historical Society in 1954, reveal that church authorities pressured him to minimize coverage. Sims wrote, "Bishop Crawford visited personally to ensure we printed nothing that might cause panic or damage the church's reputation. He seemed more frightened than concerned about scandal." The initial investigation stalled when Sheriff Hackett himself disappeared while conducting a second examination of the chapel site in April 1895. His horse returned riderless to town, but no trace of Hackett was ever found. Deputy Marshal Samuel Crawford, dispatched from Frankfort to investigate Hackett's disappearance, concluded his investigation within 48 hours and recommended that the chapel be demolished immediately. The building was destroyed in May 1895, but not before several residents reported witnessing strange phenomena around the site. Mill worker Isaiah Brent told his family, according to oral history collected by folklorist Dr. Susan Matthews in 1971, that he observed lights moving within the abandoned chapel at night, accompanied by sounds he described as singing, but not in any human language I ever heard. Most significantly, 3 children from nearby farms claimed to have encountered Father Giles himself walking the road between town and the chapel site in late April. The children, questioned separately by family members, provided consistent descriptions of Giles appearing normal, except for his eyes, which they said reflected light like an animal's, and he spoke without moving his lips. The case attracted serious academic attention in 1964 when Dr. Patricia Woodhouse, professor of American religious history at Yale University, obtained access to previously sealed diocesan archives. Her research, published in the Journal of Appalachian Studies in 1967, established that Father Giles had corresponded extensively with colleagues about his growing belief that traditional Christianity represented only a surface layer concealing much older, more powerful spiritual forces. Letters discovered in the Vatican secret archives, released through Dr. Woodhouse's connections with Catholic University, reveal that Giles had requested permission to study pre-Christian religious sites throughout eastern Kentucky. He believed that St. Bartholomew's Chapel had been constructed directly over what he termed a convergence point of ancient energies. Church authorities had explicitly forbidden such investigations, but Giles continued his research privately. Dr. Woodhouse's investigation took an ominous turn in late 1967. Her final report describes discovering a cave system beneath the former chapel site during archaeological excavations that autumn. The caves contained carved symbols matching those found in the chapel, along with evidence of recent human occupation. More disturbing, her team discovered clothing fragments that appeared to match items documented in the 1895 disappearance. Dr. Woodhouse's final journal entry, dated December 3, 1967, described her decision to explore deeper sections of the cave system alone after her research assistants refused to continue. She wrote, "I can hear them singing down there, the same hymns Father Giles taught his congregation, but changed somehow, transformed into something that makes my skin crawl. I must know what happened to those people." Dr. Woodhouse was found 3 days later at the bottom of a ravine 2 miles from the chapel site. The official cause of death was listed as accidental fall, but the county coroner noted several unexplained factors. Her body showed no injuries consistent with falling. Her clothing was perfectly clean despite lying outdoors for days, and most puzzling, she appeared to have died with the expression of complete serenity on her face. Following Dr. Woodhouse's death, Eastern Kentucky University sealed access to the chapel site and classified all related research materials. However, Forest Service reports from the 1970s and 1980s document continued unusual activity in the area. Rangers reported discovering groups of people conducting nighttime gatherings near the former chapel location, though when approached, these individuals would simply vanish into the forest. Particularly disturbing was a 1979 incident involving park ranger Michael Torres, who reported encountering a group of approximately 40 people dressed in period clothing, walking along the old chapel road at midnight. When Torres approached with his vehicle headlights illuminated, he observed that the figures cast no shadows and appeared to be walking several inches above the ground surface. Torres's written report, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests in 1995, describes following the group to the former chapel site, where they arranged themselves in the same circular pattern described in the 1895 investigation. According to Torres, the figures then began to sink into the ground as if the earth were liquid, disappearing completely within minutes. The most recent documented incident occurred in 1988 when Geological Survey team leader Dr. Robert Chen attempted to conduct ground-penetrating radar analysis of the chapel site for the U.S. Geological Survey. His equipment consistently malfunctioned when positioned over areas matching the 1895 burn patterns, displaying readings that suggested vast hollow spaces beneath the surface, despite previous studies indicating solid bedrock. Dr. Chen's team abandoned their survey after recording audio anomalies during their 3rd day of work. Digital analysis of their tapes, conducted at Georgetown University's acoustics laboratory, revealed human voices singing beneath the audible range, with phonetic patterns matching no known language but exhibiting structured grammatical properties. Contemporary investigations by paranormal researchers have documented additional evidence suggesting that whatever happened at Kentucky Ridge in 1895 continues to exert influence today. The area maintains an unusually high rate of missing persons reports, with Kentucky State Police files showing 17 unexplained disappearances within a 5-mile radius of the chapel site since 1970. Most of these disappearances follow similar patterns. Individuals traveling alone through the area report feeling compelled to stop their vehicles and walk into the forest. Search teams consistently find abandoned cars with keys still in the ignition, personal belongings undisturbed but no trace of the missing persons. Local residents, particularly those whose families lived in the area during the 1890s, continue to report encounters with figures matching descriptions of Father Giles and his congregation. These sightings occur most frequently during winter months and always involve the figures attempting to communicate with living persons, gesturing for them to follow toward the former chapel site. Dr. Amanda Foster, professor of folklore studies at Appalachian State University, conducted extensive interviews with area residents in 2010 for her book Vanished Congregations: Religious Mysteries of Rural Appalachia. Her research revealed that local families maintain detailed oral traditions about identifying and avoiding what they term the walking faithful. According to these traditions, encounters with Father Giles's congregation can be recognized by several specific signs. The figures appear solid and normal from a distance, but become increasingly translucent as they approach. They emit no body heat despite appearing fully clothed, and most crucially, they speak in unison, even when appearing to hold individual conversations. The family's doctor, Foster interviewed, emphasized that anyone who follows these figures toward the chapel site becomes part of their eternal congregation. They described the disappeared persons as neither alive nor dead, but existing in a state of perpetual religious devotion to entities that predate human civilization by millennia. Modern technology has provided additional evidence supporting these accounts. Trail cameras installed by the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife have captured numerous images of groups moving through the forest at night, though the figures appear only as vague outlines, even in infrared photography. More unsettling, these images consistently show the groups moving in perfect formation, despite the dense forest terrain that should make such coordination impossible. The Kentucky Ridge incident represents far more than a simple historical mystery. The documented evidence, spanning over a century, suggests that Father Giles and his congregation discovered something beneath their chapel that fundamentally altered their existence. Whether through contact with underground entities, exposure to unknown geological phenomena, or genuine supernatural intervention, 38 people vanished from our world while remaining eternally present in the Kentucky mountains. Perhaps most disturbing is the growing evidence that their influence extends beyond the immediate area. Missing persons reports with similar characteristics have been documented throughout Appalachian regions, always involving isolated religious communities and always occurring near sites with pre-Christian historical significance. The pattern suggests that Father Giles's discovery was not unique, but part of a larger network of locations where the boundaries between our world and something far older have worn dangerously thin. His congregation may have been among the first to cross that boundary, but they were certainly not the last. Today, the Kentucky Ridge area remains officially closed to public access, though the barriers fail to prevent the steady stream of individuals who feel compelled to visit the site. Local law enforcement maintains detailed protocols for identifying and intercepting these potential victims before they can reach the former chapel location. If you find yourself traveling through eastern Kentucky and feel an unexpected urge to explore isolated mountain areas, particularly during winter months, recognize this as a warning sign. The walking faithful continue their eternal recruitment, and Father Giles still preaches his corrupted gospel to anyone willing to listen to voices that should have been silenced over a century ago.